The room smelled like recycled air and old ambition. That's the first thing Petra Asamoah noticed when she walked into the National Defense Legal Review Board hearing in Ottawa. Not the flags, not the paneled wood walls, not the row of men in uniforms sitting behind a table long enough to seat a hockey team. Just that smell. Like the ventilation system had been pumping the same air since 1987, and nobody had thought to open a window. She was 29 years old. She had a backpack over one shoulder because she hadn't owned a briefcase a week ago, and buying one felt dishonest. She was wearing her sister's blazer, navy, slightly too wide in the shoulders, and she had taken this 47 bus from her apartment in Vanier because her car had been impounded in March and she hadn't gotten around to dealing with it yet. What she did not have: a lawyer. What she did have: 7 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 tours in Latvia with NATO's enhanced forward presence, 1 commendation she never talked about, and a mind that worked like a filing cabinet that nobody had ever taught her to lock. The board hadn't expected her to show up at all. That much was clear from the way the clerk at the front desk looked up from her computer and blinked twice when Petra gave her name, like she was checking whether the name matched a person who was supposed to exist in this building. "Corporal Asamoah," the clerk said. "I'm not a corporal anymore," Petra said. "But yes." The man at the center of the table was named Colonel Aldrich Pembroke. He had the kind of face that had probably looked distinguished at 40 and hadn't changed much since. Silver at the temples, a jaw like the corner of a desk, eyes that had learned to look at people the way you look at furniture. He'd written 3 policy manuals that were still in use across the CF. He had a Wikipedia page. He had been quoted in the Globe and Mail 4 times. He had also, as far as Petra could determine, built a dismissal case against her, using a procedural technicality that didn't actually exist in the regulations he was citing. That was the thing. That was the only thing. She had known it for 3 weeks. She had read the section 47 times, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to be sure she wasn't wrong, in the way that people who want something very badly can convince themselves they're right. She had read it at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. She had read it on her phone on the bus. She had read it sitting on the floor of her bathroom with her back against the tub, because sometimes rooms feel too big when you're trying to think. The regulation didn't say what Pembroke's filing said, it said. It just didn't, and either he knew that or he'd never read it himself, and she wasn't sure which one was worse. She sat down at the respondent's table, alone, no counsel, a yellow legal pad in front of her, and she looked at him the way she'd learned to look at things in Latvia. Steady. Take it in. Don't perform. He didn't look back at her for a long time. Here is what had happened, if you want the version that fits on one page. Petra had been stationed at CFB Petawawa for 14 months when her unit was assigned a new commanding officer. His name was Major Hartwick. He was the kind of man who announced his own credentials in the first 5 minutes of every conversation, not because anyone had asked, but because the silence made him nervous. He had done Gagetown. He had done Cyprus. He had a theory about everything and a tolerance for disagreement that ran about as deep as a parking lot puddle in August. In November, during a training review, Petra had flagged an error in the operational plan. Not a small error, the kind of error that, if it had been replicated in a live environment, would have put people on the wrong side of a perimeter at the wrong time. She flagged it the way you're supposed to flag it, in writing, through the chain. She attached the relevant section of the plan. She attached the standard. Major Hartwick had filed a conduct report within 72 hours. The language was careful. Words like insubordinate attitude and undermining command authority and disruptive to unit cohesion. The kind of language that doesn't leave fingerprints. She had grieved it. The grievance went up. It came back down. It went up again. And then somehow, 6 months later, she was sitting in a review board hearing in Ottawa, facing a dismissal recommendation and the regulation being used to justify it. National Defense Administrative Order 50/19-2, Section 11 by, said something entirely different from what the filing claimed. She had the document in her backpack. She had highlighted the relevant line in yellow. She'd also highlighted 3 case summaries from previous board decisions, 2 of which had been written by panels that included Pembroke himself. She hadn't told anyone this. Not the duty legal officer who'd called her and left a voicemail. Not her sister. Not the friend from her unit who had texted twice asking if she needed anything. She just had it. She sat with it. She waited. The hearing opened the way these things open. Procedural statements, declarations for the record, a summary of the complaint read aloud by a clerk in a voice designed to make everything sound both serious and inevitable. Petra wrote the date on the top of her legal pad. She drew a small line under it. She waited. Pembroke spoke for 11 minutes. She counted. He had the cadence of someone who had said the same things in rooms like this many times, not rushing, not performing, just stating. This is what the regulation says. This is what the respondent did. This is the standard outcome for this category of infraction. There was a man 2 seats to Pembroke's left, a civilian board member, reading glasses perched at the very end of his nose, who was nodding slightly with each sentence. The kind of nodding that isn't agreement exactly, just the physical acknowledgement that words are being received. When Pembroke finished, he looked at Petra for the first time, not at her face, at her file. The respondent chose to represent herself, he said. Not a question, more like noting the weather. I did, she said. Do you have a statement to make before the board proceeds to deliberation? She looked at him. She thought about her apartment in Vanier. She thought about the 647 bus and the recycled air and the blazer that was half an inch too wide in both shoulders, and the 7 years she had given to something she had actually believed in. I have a question, she said, about the regulation you cited. There was a shift in the room. Small. The kind of thing that wouldn't read in any transcript, but that anyone who's been in rooms where power operates would recognize immediately. The civilian member with the reading glasses stopped nodding. The clerk near the door looked up from her desk. Pembroke looked at Petra then. Actually at her, not at the file. The floor is yours, he said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite impatience. The sound of a man who expects to be back at his desk by noon. Petra opened her backpack. She took out a printed copy of NDO 5019-2. She had brought 7 copies, 1 for herself, 1 for each of the 5 board members, 1 extra. She had paper-clipped them. She stood up and walked to the table and set them down, 1 in front of each person, the way you'd hand out agendas at a meeting. Then she went back to her chair. Section 11, she said. The section cited in the dismissal filing. She opened her own copy. The relevant line was in yellow. The filing states that Section 11 by establishes a mandatory review process that authorizes administrative separation without grievance rights in cases of, and I'm quoting the filing here, repeated conduct infractions within a single posting period. She paused, not for effect, just because the next part mattered and she wanted to say it cleanly. That's not what Section 11 says. Nobody spoke. To Pembroke's credit, and Petra would think about this later on the bus home, he didn't immediately push back. He opened the document. She watched him find the section. She watched him read it. She watched something move across his face that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it, the way a shadow is adjacent to the thing casting it. Section 11 by of NDO 59-2 didn't establish mandatory administrative separation in cases of repeated conduct infractions. What it actually did, what it had always done since the revision in 2018, was establish a review period, a mandatory review period, during which a member retained full grievance rights, during which no separation action could be finalized, without a secondary sign-off from a legal advisor outside the originating chain of command. None of those things had happened. Not one of them. She knew because she had read it 47 times, and because reading things carefully was something she had been doing since she was 9 years old, and her mother had told her that the world would give her two choices: believe what people told her, or find out for herself. And her mother was from Accra and had raised 4 daughters in Scarborough and knew something about how those choices land. "I'd also like to draw the board's attention," Petra said, "to the decision summary from the 2021 Beauchamp-Lefebvre hearing." She flipped to the second tab in her copy. "And the 2020 decision in the matter of Warrant Officer Singh. Both of which were decided under this same section. Both of which preserved grievance rights. Both of which, I should note, were decided by panels that included a majority of the members sitting at this table today." The civilian board member with the reading glasses took his glasses off. It took 43 minutes. Not to decide, to get through what came after her statement. The board asked for a recess. There was quiet conversation on the far side of the room. At one point, a woman Petra hadn't noticed before, positioned near the back, sitting very still, leaned forward and said something to the clerk that the clerk wrote down. Petra sat at her table and looked at the window. It was November. The sky over Ottawa was the color of unbleached cotton. She thought about Latvia, about the particular quality of cold on the Latvian plain in February, not the same as Ontario cold, which bites and lets go, but a kind of cold that settles in and stays, like it's made a decision about you. She thought about the morning she'd found the error in the operational plan. How she'd sat with it for 2 days before filing the report because she had known, with the certainty of someone who has learned to read rooms, what filing it would cost her. She had filed it anyway, because the alternative was knowing she hadn't. When the board reconvened, Pembroke was the one who spoke. His voice was the same, steady, practiced, the voice of a man who had learned not to perform his own discomfort in public. "The board is adjourning this hearing," he said, pending a procedural review of the filing documentation. Petra wrote that down on her legal pad. She underlined it once. "You'll be notified by mail of the next steps," the clerk said, from her desk by the door. "Okay," Petra said. She capped her pen. She put the legal pad back in her backpack. She stood up, put on her coat. The navy one, with the broken zipper pull, she kept meaning to fix, and she picked up her backpack and walked out of the room. Nobody followed her. Nobody stopped her in the hallway to say anything. She took the elevator to the ground floor and walked through the lobby and pushed through the heavy glass door and stood outside on the steps in the November cold. She checked her phone. The 122 bus back to Vanier left from Spark Street in 11 minutes. She started walking. She thought about calling her sister. She thought about it for half a block and then didn't, because there wasn't much to say yet, and because her sister would ask questions she didn't have answers to. And because sometimes the thing you've just done needs to sit in silence for a little while before it becomes a story. The bus was on time. She got on, tapped her card, found a seat near the back by the window. The city moved past. The canal, the traffic on Colonel By, the cluster of apartment buildings east of the Rideau, the familiar landmarks of a life that had been waiting for her while she was in a hearing room arguing about a regulation she'd memorized at a kitchen table at 2 a.m. She hadn't won yet. She knew that. Adjournment isn't a verdict. Procedural review isn't reinstatement. There would be letters and timelines and probably more rooms like that one, more tables, more men looking at files that contained her name without quite looking at her. But Section 11 by said what it said, and she had read it, and she had walked into that room alone with a backpack and a highlighted printout and her sister's blazer, and she had said it out loud in front of 5 people who had the power to end her career, and not one of them had been able to tell her she was wrong. The bus crossed the bridge. Below, the Ottawa River was gray-green and very still. She put her earbuds in. She looked out the window. She let the city take her home.